September 2025. The world woke to a headline that felt like thunder. Splitting the sky, united. State suspends all immigration from Burkina. Faso. Those 10 words sent shockwaves from Washington to Ouagadougou. Within hours, more than 12,000 Burkina citizens in America, workers, families, students, found their lives frozen in uncertainty. Airports turned chaotic. At JFK, students clutched passports with trembling hands. In Houston, construction crews were told their work permits would soon expire. Across the nation, confusion spread faster than the news itself. Outside the White House, protesters gathered, voices rising over placards that read, "We are not collateral, we are human." In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. His response was firm, unshaken. This is not policy, this is punishment. This is tyranny disguised as law, and it is an insult to Africa. His words cut across the air like fire. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, from Bamako to New York, people poured into the streets. Flags waved. Chants echoed, "Africa will not bow." Western media called it another Trump shock, but behind closed doors, diplomats whispered about something far deeper. A hidden agenda. This wasn't about borders. It was about power, leverage, and control. By nightfall, the situation spiraled. At airports, students who had flown in for the fall semester were detained. Their visas suddenly void. Some broke down in tears, calling home in disbelief. In Washington, lawyers' phones rang nonstop, desperate voices pleading, "My status is gone. What do I do now?" The numbers told the story. 12,000 affected, 5,300 students, but numbers couldn't measure the fear. In dorm rooms, young men and women packed in silence, unsure if tomorrow would bring deportation. Mothers clutched their children tighter at immigration offices, waiting for answers that never came. Back in Africa, radio stations buzzed with fury. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy holding handwritten signs. "We are not criminals. We are students." In Mali and Niger, solidarity marches filled the squares. The Sahel was rising, united by anger and pride. When Traoré addressed his nation the next day, his words didn't just echo through microphones, they ignited hearts. This is not immigration control. This is economic warfare. It is an attempt to bend a sovereign nation, and Africa will not kneel. The streets roared, students waved flags from rooftops, miners left their shafts to join protests. It was no longer about visas. It was about dignity. Across the world, reactions poured in. The African Union held an emergency meeting, condemning the ban as discriminatory. European analysts called it short-sighted, questioning the logic of targeting a nation with such a small migrant flow. But in Washington, Donald Trump doubled down. At a rally, he declared, "If they want access to our markets, they will respect our rules." The crowd cheered. The clip spread across American television, but in Africa, it played with fury. By the week's end, what began as an immigration issue had evolved into a geopolitical storm, a test of sovereignty between a superpower and a small, defiant nation. Burkina Faso was now the eye of that storm, and Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a radical, had become a symbol of resistance. At the White House, the explanation was brief, almost casual: national security and migration control. But the scope was far beyond anything seen before. Not only were new visas frozen, thousands already in the U.S. were told their status would soon be revoked. Families waiting to reunite were left in limbo. On the surface, it looked like just another immigration crackdown. But within days, a question began to echo through the diplomatic corridors. Why Burkina Faso? A nation with no mass migration, no crisis at its borders. Why now? The answer came through a leak. A European newspaper obtained a classified memo exchanged between the U.S. State Department and the National Security Council. Its words were cold and calculated. African student networks in the United States are being leveraged to support independent financial and political strategies driven by Ibrahim Traoré and allied Sahel states. Immediate containment required. Buried halfway down the document was a line that said it all. Visa leverage provides bargaining power over extractive concessions. Priority: gold and oil. And in that moment, the truth became clear. This wasn't about immigration. It was about resources, resistance, and revenge. It was never just about visas. It was about pressure, about choking a small nation until it surrendered its gold. its land, its will. In Ouagadougou, the response came fast. Within hours, the government formed a crisis command, gathering data on every Burkina citizen trapped abroad, especially the students stranded across American universities. Phone lines flooded. Parents called in panic. Will my son be deported? Will my daughter's degree be worthless now? That evening, President Ibrahim Traoré spoke again, his tone sharp as steel. They want to turn our children into hostages. They want to make our youth collateral for their greed. But Africa's future is not for sale. His defiance became a rallying cry. In Ouagadougou, students poured into the streets with banners reading, "Education is not a crime." In Bamako and Niamey, thousands marched in solidarity, and in Washington, D.C., Burkina students organized sit-ins, refusing to leave campus quietly. Their American classmates joined them, chanting together, "Let them learn." Meanwhile, U.S. officials held their ground. At another campaign rally, Donald Trump thundered, "We will not let tiny nations use our country as a base to undermine us. If they want our markets, they will follow our rules." The crowd roared with approval, but across the globe, diplomats winced. The mask had slipped. What the leaked memo had whispered, Trump had now said aloud, this wasn't immigration control. It was economic coercion. Dressed up as policy, African leaders began connecting the dots. First, the seized gold reserves, then the IMF's collateral clauses. Now, the weaponization of visas. Each move carried the same message: make Africa pay for its independence. Inside the United Nations, African ambassadors demanded answers. Since when is education a threat to global security? One asked. No reply came. Only silence. Thick, deliberate silence. Back home, Traoré convened an emergency council. Options were debated fiercely. Should they protest at the UN? Recall ambassadors? Seek emergency partnerships elsewhere? One minister urged caution. We can't afford isolation. Traoré looked him dead in the eye. They've already isolated us. The question isn't whether we stand alone. It's whether we stand with dignity. His words echoed across the room. Soon after, reports emerged. Russia and China had quietly reached out, offering scholarships and labor visas to the students expelled from America. The message was unmistakable. If Washington closed one door, others were ready to open theirs. For the White House, the visa freeze was meant to be a show of dominance. Instead, it became a spark. What began as a Burkina Faso crisis was turning into a continental awakening. The struggle was no longer about papers, it was about sovereignty. Across the Sahel, the fire spread. In Bamako, hundreds of students marched to the U.S. Embassy, shouting, "If you deport them, deport us all." In Niamey, Niger's parliament erupted in anger. Opposition leaders accused Washington of taking Africa hostage through economic intimidation. For many, the message was simple. An attack on one African nation was an attack on all. The images went viral. At Howard University, Burkina students staged a 2-day sit-in. They stretched banners across the campus lawns. "We are scholars, not pawns." American students joined in, chanting alongside them. On Pennsylvania Avenue, a crowd gathered opposite the White House, waving placards that read, "Education is not a crime. Africa is not collateral." For the first time, ordinary Americans saw the faces behind the policy, young Africans caught in the crossfire of a global power struggle. In Burkina Faso, Traoré turned the crisis into a movement. His national address echoed through radios, TVs, and phones across the country. They thought they could break us by targeting our children, but instead, they have united us. Africa is not a land of subjects, we are partners, or we are nothing at all. The line exploded online. Within hours, "We are not collateral" trended across Africa. From Dar es Salaam to Johannesburg, students lit candles and held vigils. In Ghana, activists projected Traoré's speech onto the walls of Independence Arch. The visa ban, meant to isolate Burkina Faso, had instead awakened a continent. But the fight was no longer just on the streets. Diplomacy itself had become a battlefield. Rumors swirled that U.S. envoys offered quiet deals to other African governments. Distance yourselves from Traoré, and your students' visas will be spared. It was the oldest trick in the book, divide and rule. Some leaders hesitated. Some stayed silent, but none failed to notice. In Ouagadougou's cafes, people joked bitterly, "They're not canceling visas. They're auctioning them." Traoré's counterstrike came swiftly. He welcomed delegations from Moscow and Beijing. not behind closed doors. But in daylight, Russian diplomats promised emergency scholarships. Chinese envoys hinted at labor exchanges and new student programs. If one door closes, another opens, one ambassador smiled for the cameras. The message shook Western capitals. On live European TV, an analyst admitted grimly, this could push the Sahel directly into rival spheres of influence. And for the first time, the West realized its own sanctions had built the bridge it feared most. The administration believed the policy would bend a small nation. Instead, it lit a fuse. At campaign rallies, President Trump fanned the flames, mocking any turn toward rivals. If they think Moscow or Beijing will save them, let them try. They'll regret it, the crowd roared. Across Africa, the clip landed like an insult. Radio hosts replayed that line with burning disbelief. Are we little countries, or are we sovereign nations? Back in Ouagadougou, the human cost deepened. Families of students waited by their phones, each ring a cliff edge of hope or dread. Overseas, workers saw contracts vanish. Remittances slowed, and markets in the capital tightened. Prices climbed on shelves once full of imported staples. Yet despair did not win. Neighborhoods pooled money for those in need. Teachers staged free classes for students who might be sent home mid-term. If they send you back, one educator told a trembling group, you will still learn. You will still build, then the streets answered. The protests swelled, massive, thunderous, and resolute. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands poured into the avenues, faces lifted, fists raised. Photographs of detained students were carried like banners. Police lined the route, but the crowd's discipline kept the march peaceful. Their chant cut through the air. Our children are not bargaining chips. In other cities, the symbolism turned violent only on paper. Effigies of contracts were hurled into flame in Bamako and Nami. The firelight painted Independence Square red. Walls across towns bore one sprayed phrase again and again, cancel the blackmail. The world watched. European anchors began to shift their language. Opinion pages questioned the morality of penalizing young scholars. Even some U.S. editorials asked aloud, why punish the students for political disagreement? But Washington pushed further. Permits for Burkina workers in agriculture and construction were slated to lapse. Shipments of food and medicine into the Sahel were delayed for endless inspections. Trucks idled at ports while shelves emptied. The message hardened, comply or be choked. Inside the presidential palace, ministers worked through the night. Maps, spreadsheets, and grim forecasts littered the table. The finance minister warned of shrinking reserves, rising prices, the seeds of unrest. Another urged negotiation, a symbolic concession to relieve pressure. Yet Traoré's answer was absolute. He leaned forward, voice low and unyielding. They will not stop at visas. If we bow today, they will take our gold tomorrow and our sovereignty the day after. Better to face hunger than to barter away our dignity. The line steadied the room. It also leaked, intentionally or not, and the leak became a rallying call. Across the continent, millions recognized the stakes. This was no longer a bilateral quarrel. It was a test. Would Africa accept old instruments of domination, or would it refuse to be priced into submission? By the last days of September 2025, the crisis had swelled into a continental storm. What began as a visa decree had become a question of who would write the next chapter of West Sahel relations. In Washington, leaders doubled down as policy hardened into punishment. In Ouagadougou and beyond, ordinary citizens stepped forward with a new clarity. The conflict was about far more than travel papers. It was a contest over dignity, resources, and the right to decide one's own future. And as drums rolled through Revolution Square, the message rang clear. Africa would not be reduced to a footnote in someone else's ledger. It began not with speeches or decrees, but with words scribbled on city walls. Better hunger than chains. By sunrise, the phrase had become a movement. Posters appeared on buses, schools, and market stalls. The words echoed through the streets, a defiant heartbeat in the capital of a nation that refused to kneel. Inside radio studios, hosts read the slogan on air. By noon, it was a chant. By dusk, a song. The melody rose from courtyards and classrooms, from soldiers and students alike. A single sentence had captured an entire continent's exhaustion and its hope. The diplomatic chessboard. While the people found their voice, the world's powers began to move their pieces. Russian and Chinese delegations no longer hid their presence in Ouagadougou. Their cars rolled through the capital openly, flags fluttering beneath the desert sun. Behind closed doors, Russian officials discussed emergency fuel deliveries. Chinese envoys spoke of scholarships for students stranded by America's visa freeze. Nothing was signed, not yet. But the symbolism was louder than any treaty. Across Western capitals, alarm bells rang. Analysts warned Washington's immigration freeze may backfire, pushing the Sahel closer to Moscow and Beijing. In a leaked memo, one diplomat admitted, "We wanted to isolate Traoré, but we've turned him into a symbol." Washington in the U.S., the mood was shifting. Civil rights groups filed lawsuits, calling the immigration freeze discriminatory. Universities released statements of protest. Editorials appeared in the New York Times and The Guardian. We punish the young for political disagreements. And in doing so, we drive Africa into the arms of our rivals. But in the White House, the message was different. Trump, ever defiant, saw the crisis as leverage. "They want our markets," he told a roaring crowd in Ohio. "They'll learn to respect our terms, or they'll pay the price." The cheers were deafening. But halfway across the world, those words landed like sparks in dry grass. Revolution Square. The next morning, tens of thousands gathered beneath the scorching Sahel sun. Revolution Square trembled with energy. Flags waving, drums thundering, the air heavy with heat and purpose. At the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, calm, and unshaken. His voice carried across the city. "They believe our future is theirs to decide. They believe our children abroad can be used to break us. But I tell you today, Burkina Faso does not beg. Africa does not kneel." The crowd roared. The chant rose like a storm. "Africa will not bow. Africa will not bow." Drums echoed through the city. The sound rolled across borders, into Mali, Niger, and Guinea, a wave of unity no decree could contain. The awakening, by the final week of September 2025, the standoff had reached its breaking point. Visas were still frozen, shipments delayed, students stranded. But something had changed, something intangible yet unstoppable. A decree meant to choke a small nation had awakened a continent. In Bamako, students turned public squares into classrooms. In Niamey, farmers pooled grain for families who had lost remittances. In Accra and Dakar, artists painted murals of Traoré standing tall beneath the words, "We are not collateral." Radio stations played songs of unity. Hashtags trended across the continent. For the first time in decades, Africa spoke not as scattered voices, but as one. Inside the palace late one evening, Traoré stood before his cabinet. The room was tense, filled with maps, reports, and exhaustion. Food reserves were thinning, prices rising. The ministers looked to him for answers. He said nothing for a moment, then spoke quietly. "They will not stop at visas. They will not stop at ships. Today they demand silence. Tomorrow they will demand our gold. The day after, our sovereignty. Better we endure hunger than surrender our dignity." The words leaked to the press by morning. By afternoon, they were on posters. By nightfall, they were legend. Across the continent, from Dar es Salaam to Johannesburg, vigils lit the night. Students held candles under banners that read, "Knowledge is freedom." In Nairobi, protesters chanted outside embassies, "Education is not a crime." Even in Washington, Burkina-based students refused to be silent. They marched through university halls chanting, "Let them learn," joined by American classmates who understood that dignity knows no border. A shift in the West and Europe, something unexpected happened. Newspapers began to turn. Commentators spoke of moral failure. An editorial in Paris read, "America sought to discipline a nation, and instead revived a continent." Even within the U.S., voices rose in dissent. Lawmakers questioned whether this policy had weakened America's moral standing. But in the Oval Office, there was only silence, and a growing sense that the narrative was slipping away. The final address on the last evening of September, the sky over Ouagadougou blazed with sunset. Revolution Square filled again, tens of thousands strong. Flags waved. Drums beat. Traoré stepped to the podium. His words carried through every loudspeaker, across every radio, every phone, every heart. They can suspend visas, they can delay ships, they can try to make us afraid, but they cannot cancel our dignity. They cannot silence a continent that has found its voice. He paused. The crowd held its breath. This struggle is not Burkina Faso's alone. It belongs to Africa, and Africa will decide whether to bow or to rise. The response came like thunder. "Rise! Rise, Africa, rise!" From Ouagadougou to Lagos, the chant echoed into the night, and for that moment, Hunger and uncertainty gave way to something stronger: unity. The legacy. The months ahead remained uncertain. Would Russia and China bring true independence, or a new kind of dependence? Would Washington relent or harden further? No one knew. But one truth was undeniable: Africa had spoken, and silence, once broken, would never return. Epilogue. In the final frame, the camera pans across the city. Murals glowing under streetlights, students studying beneath candlelight, families listening to the radio. A narrator's voice cuts through the silence. From the embers of crisis rose a continent's voice, not of submission, but of sovereignty, not of despair, but of dignity. The world expected silence. Instead, it heard Africa, and as the screen fades to black, the final words appear. Bold, defiant, and unyielding, the struggle continues, but we won't bow.